Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 7th session of Medicine by Design's Translation Talks for summer 2020. I am delighted this morning to be hosting such an experienced panel to talk to all of our participants about translating research into impact. For those of you that have not met me, my name is Allison Brown. I'm the Director of Strategy and Translation here at Medicine by Design. And before we dive into today's discussion and introduce you to our panelists, I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of the trainees who participated in Translation Talks up until now. We started this series of weekly webinars back in June. And I hope that everyone has found the sessions led by CCRM and other partners helpful. And I really hope that with the panel today, we can sort of bring everything to life and inspire all of you in the audience to pursue opportunities to develop products, start new companies based on the research that you're conducting. We also have quite a number of new participants today, new trainees, as well as principal investigators and members of University of Toronto Entrepreneurship, some of our tech transfer offices, industry partners, not only within Toronto, but also from across the country. So welcome, everyone. We have a few questions queued up for our panelists today, but we would also want to hear from the audience. So we're going to go to the audience soon to start taking your questions. Please enter them through the chat function in Zoom, and we look forward to hearing from everyone. To kick things off, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their role in the life sciences and biotech ecosystem in Canada, how they got on their career path, and maybe thinking back 15 years, 10 years, if you sort of had to give yourself some advice, what would it be? So we'll go around and we'll kick things off with that. And then we'll go to the floor for an opening question. So I'm going to pick on people in the order that you appear on my screen. So Mara, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks, Allison. Good morning, everybody. I tend to do that also, where I pick on people in the order, and now I know what it feels like. So thanks for having me on this panel. So I am Mara Lederman. I am a professor of strategic management in the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. My background is as an economist, so I have a PhD in economics, and I joined U of T in 2003 after finishing school at MIT. I spent the first maybe 7 to 10 years of my career as a fairly standard social science-based researcher, doing research, doing teaching, publishing, going to conferences, speaking, doing all the things we do to get tenure and follow that path. My areas of research at the time were primarily what we call in economics industrial organization. So how do industries work? How do companies compete? When do markets work? When do markets not work? And organizational design. And so the economics of how companies and firms should organize to achieve their strategic objectives. About, 5 or 6 years ago now, I got involved with the Creative Destruction Lab. And for those who don't know what the Creative Destruction Lab is, Allison, is okay if I just give a 1-minute version?
Absolutely.
So it's a mentorship program founded at the University of Toronto for massively scalable seed stage science-based startups. So we're now 8 years old. We now operate at 8 universities around the world, 9 actually. We just launched a brand new site this week. And the program is focused on technical founders who are at the seed stage, who are interested in commercializing science. Many of our companies are coming out of university labs, and our program runs them through sort of an intensive 9-month sort of mentorship program where founders interact with a group of highly accomplished investors, entrepreneurs, and scientists who help them build out sort of the business side of their companies. Companies usually come in at the seed stage. By the end, they've raised maybe a seed round and or maybe a little bit further along. And so I've been running that for the last 5 years. I was involved first as a faculty member. Now I run the Toronto site, and I also run our partners program, of which Medicine by Design is one of our partners. So the question of what advice would you give yourself 15 years ago? I tried to think a lot about that. It's a hard question because you don't want to admit what you wish you had known. And so I tried to come up with something I've been thinking about that applies to me in my academic field, but I suspect applies to many people here, which is being more, I think when you're coming out of academia, on one hand, there's sort of a very direct path that you kind of know is the typical path most academics follow. On the other hand, you know that there's tons of opportunities you can pursue. And whether that's starting a company in your case, or as an economist, working at a company like Amazon or the World Bank, or getting into antitrust work, or there's so many things you could do. And then there's all the paths within universities and within the broader ecosystem. And for me, I wish I had been given the advice to be better at balancing kind of the exploration, try different things, see what you like, versus the exploitation, think about where you want to be in, in 20 years and find the path to get there. And I don't have advice of how to do that, but the one thing I've observed from watching so many entrepreneurs over the last few years, and so many of our mentors who have built sort of massive companies, is they have this ability to look 15 years out and set these incredibly ambitious and seemingly impossible goals and figure out the 15-year plan to get there. And I think that applies to all of us in our career. So that's what I would have liked to have said, hey, you should be thinking about both of these things at the same time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mara. Great introduction. Shana, we'll go to you.
Thanks, Allison. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. I'm Shana Kelley. I'm also a professor at the University of Toronto. I'm in the Faculty of Pharmacy, also cross-pointed to chemistry, biochemistry, and biomedical engineering. I run an interdisciplinary research group that functions at the intersection of chemistry, biology, engineering, and medicine. And we work on a variety of different things, including the development of new diagnostic technologies and platforms for drug discovery. And so, the research group obviously is focused on technology development. We also train lots of folks that go into the pharma industry, the biotech industry, the broader life sciences industry, academia, government labs. We've probably had over 40 PhD level scientists at this point kind of come through and go off to do great things with their careers. And our work is highly translational. So we really try to push the basic discoveries that we make, think about them as technology platforms, think about their applications, and then eventually can we either partner with existing commercial organizations to deliver these new technologies or discoveries to the clinic or to society, or through startup companies. I've been the co-founder of 3 different companies, all molecular diagnostics focused. One that was based in the US, sold to a large diagnostic company in the US, another that was based in Toronto, sold to a US defense contractor. And then my third company just got going about a year ago, still incubating and seed funded by Facet. It's a JLabs company. It's called Cellular Analytics. And so have had quite a bit of experience just with the startup life cycle. And then I'm also the director of Prime, which is a precision medicine focused initiative, but precision medicine very broadly defined. So anything related to drug discovery, diagnostic development, disease biology, organ on a chip, all of these things where University of Toronto is really strong, but in all these areas we're spread across campus. So we bring together over 70 researchers in 15 different departments at the University of Toronto to really create a community around these areas. We have about 100 trainees that are involved with Prime. And one of the core aspects of our mission is to help our entire community be more translational, to think more about how to take great research discoveries in this area and turn them into startups and turn them into products. And so that's me in terms of what I wish somebody told me. There's a lot of things. The thing that immediately came to mind really is just don't sweat the small stuff. I mean, life is filled with opportunities. I think anytime an opportunity is in front of you, you have to give it 1,000% if it's something that you really want, whether it's starting a company or getting a particular job or publishing a paper, whatever that thing is. But if the answer is no, You just kind of move on and go on to the next opportunity, the next opportunity, the next opportunity. And, you know, to think about what you've learned as you go, but just not to get hung up on any one person or one organization saying no, and just persevere and just, you know, keep going until you get what you want. I think whether it's entrepreneurship or academia or whatever, you're going to hear no so many times. You have to keep searching for the yes, and you've got to keep yourself kind of positive as you go through that process. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Shana. Tamer.
Great, thanks so much, Alison, and great to hear from the other panelists. So my name is Tamer Mohamed. I'm CEO of Aspect Biosystems. I'm bringing sort of more of a perspective on kind of the company building side of things, being fully immersed in that right now. So maybe a little bit of a background on Aspect for some context. Aspect is about 6 years old right now. We spun out of the University of British Columbia with technology that enables us to create living tissues. And so we're applying that technology towards regenerative medicine, both through internal programs that we're advancing to the clinic, but we also partner very heavily with researchers on early discovery programs, as well as commercial groups on co-development opportunities that build on our platform capabilities. We have about 50 people in the company right now. We've been very fortunate to bring very smart and visionary investors to the company. We brought in about 45 million above $45 million in capital to date, a mix of venture capital and other kind of sources of funding. And so we have a lot of kind of fuel in the tank to kind of take this rocket ship to where we want to land it. We've been very fortunate to work with some of the biggest kind of pharmaceutical companies in the world, from GlaxoSmithKline to Merck, Johnson & Johnson, and others. And so my story at Aspect really begins in academia. And so the core foundational technology that we're using at Aspect started out of research that I was conducting with my co-founders at the University of British Columbia. And so the four of us, myself, Simon Bayer, Conrad Wallace, and Sam Wadsworth, were essentially researchers developing this core technology, really not appreciating or understanding what commercialization is all about. And so we were collaborating academically, and it became clear to us after several years of academic research that this was a technology that had value that could make a big impact on clinical care. And so we began to sort of really explore, well, what is the best sort of vehicle to jump on to get us there and start delivering real world impact. We were very fortunate at the time when we were thinking of that, because UBC started a program called Entrepreneurship at UBC. And so this was an entrepreneurial initiative that the university started to really bring together scientists and engineers that aspired to be entrepreneurs and provide them with the tools that they need to sort of explore the commercial and business world. And so through that program, we were really taught, I would say, lessons that seem obvious right now, but at the time they were revolutionary. So things like get out of the building. As an academician, that's probably your biggest fear, is stepping out of that lab. You don't want to let the lab code go, and so having to actually go speak to people was terrifying, and having to actually accept feedback was even more terrifying. And so but that was absolutely essential. And so through doing that exercise, by going and talking to partners, talking to customers, listening to the market, we sort of went through this process of taking a technology that had a huge potential and refining that to a specific set of problems that we were addressing, problems that had value. And really the journey, how do we build a really kind of driven team around us so that we could really take the company to the next level. So my really story is really moving from research to commercialization, and that has been done through Aspect Biosystems. I guess to touch on one of your questions, or to go back 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, I would still be in high school. And so probably the advice at the time would be quite interesting. But I mean, considering that, what I would tell myself 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even things I tell myself now is really kind of to put myself in environments where learning about new things, speaking to people that bring new perspectives, stepping out of my comfort zone, and not necessarily trying to understand how all of this connects today. Because when I look at how I solve problems today, I often go back to things that I've experienced 5, 10, 15 years ago. And at the time, I never knew how important those experiences were, how important that one thing that somebody told me was, or how important this piece of knowledge that is in a totally different domain was. But it makes sense now. And so the lesson I would give, or the advice I would give to myself and really others is really put yourselves in those environments, step out of your comfort zone, learn new things, really rely on first principles when you're trying to solve problems. That will refine your problem solving skill, and then don't worry about trying to make sense of it all, because it somehow finds a way to all connect at the end.
Thank you, Tamer. Great introduction, and I'm sure there will be lots of good questions for you, given the success that Aspect has had and the fact that you really did start in the lab and have come so far over the last few years. Mike, we'll pass things over to you.
Yeah, so I'm Mike Scott. I'm SVP of Product Development at BlueRock Therapeutics at our facility here in Toronto in the Mars Discovery District. BlueRock was founded about 3.5 years ago as a cell therapy company focused on leveraging induced pluripotent stem cells into various cell types. And so we've got leading programs in Parkinson's disease and heart failure and areas of immunology. I've been at the company since 3 years and 2 months ago, so since very close to the beginning. And over that time, we have grown significantly, and actually we were acquired last year by one of our larger investors, Bayer. So we're now owned by Bayer, but we are an independent subsidiary. So we still are masters of our future so far. I guess I can tell you a little bit about my history. So I have a couple of engineering degrees from the University of Waterloo, and then a medical biophysics PhD from Western. And from that, I was able to leverage into part of my PhD down in the States at the Cleveland Clinic. Spent 20 years after that in California at various companies, including large companies like Baxter and Edwards Life Sciences, but also at 3 different startup companies in the area of cardiac medical devices and cell therapies. And over that time, was able to work in large company environments, small, very small company environments, and was able to figure out the type of environment that really resonated with my personality and my skill sets. And for me, it was startups. So I have been in startups now for 18 years. And I think that's part of the advice going back 15 years. It was about 16 years ago when I made my first decision to jump into the startup with both feet. And I would just encourage you to take some risk, because reward doesn't come without risk, and major advancements rarely happen without taking risk. You have to push against the system, and you have to look at the status quo and say, well, that's just not good enough. If you really want to make a difference, if you want to drive change. So weigh your options carefully, but don't be afraid of taking the risk, because that's the opportunity for you to grow, experience new things. And I'll give you a little anecdote. When I was doing my master's at Waterloo, my supervisor, this was in an area we called orthopedic bioengineering at the time. And at the time, medical biophysics was a department at the hospital that fixed medical equipment. So there really wasn't a biomedical engineer specialty out there making devices and so on. And I asked my supervisor, am I going to be able to develop a career? Will I get a job in this? And he said, well, Mike, honestly, I don't know, but I can tell you this: if you're good at what you do, there will always be a place for you. So go forward with confidence and be willing to take some risks.
Great, thanks, Mike, and thank you to the panelists for a great introduction to your background and a bit of advice. It is tough to think back. Certainly, if I maybe I'll answer the question later on in the panel if we have time. So we actually, we're going to go to the floor and take a question. It's very much aligned with, I think, how we envisioned starting off this discussion. And it's related to, you know, what do you do if you have a good idea? What do you do if you have got an idea for a product? Where do you go and who do you talk to? Toronto is a big place. U of T is a big place. There are lots of different formal and informal routes. You know, one of our participants has asked specifically about the role that a university commercialization office or tech transfer office has in starting a company. But there are also, you know, other more informal routes that I'm sure our panelists can comment on, whether that's, you know, finding an advisor or someone that's done it before. And so maybe Tamer, we can start off with you. I mean, your research really informed aspect, and I'm sure you had engagement with the tech transfer office at UBC. I'd be interested in understanding sort of who did you talk to in the early days and how did you get the wheels rolling with your idea for aspect?
Yeah. So I guess in the case of kind of a university kind of based spin out or an idea that emerges kind of at a university in Canada, for example, I think most likely you'll have sort of intellectual property involved with that idea. And so at some point during the early days, you're probably going to interact with your tech transfer office, whether that's at UBC or U of T or others. And so I think really the goal there is to get clarity on sort of your, I would say your intellectual property. Depends on sort of the university's policy, whether that intellectual property will be automatically assigned to you, or if they want to actually take sort of an interest in or a stake in that. And so there'll be an initial sort of discussion. I would say my advice kind of going back to that is try not to spend a ton of time there. I don't think companies are make it or break it based off of those kind of early discussions. I think just try to get what you need from there, and if they can make connections, then fantastic. But I would say just try to get clarity on your IP. Don't try to over optimize for the best possible arrangement. Just get what you need. And this is also kind of a call on to kind of tech transfer offices. Like the amount of risks that these entrepreneurs are taking is phenomenal. So even though we might think that intellectual property at those early days are the most valuable thing ever, it really depends on the phenomenal amount of risk these entrepreneurs are going to take. And so I think setting them up for success is absolutely sort of critical. So that's probably a first stop that you're probably going to have to take. And then to your point, Allison, I think it's absolutely critical to talk to people who have done it and really pay attention to those people, because one of, I would say, the big lessons I learned is during the early days when you have an idea, you get the impression that everybody's so supportive and everybody wants your success. And that's true. I would say everybody really wants your success, but time is of the essence. And so you can't afford to speak to as many people as you can, and because that is going to give you, I would say, potentially a lot of noise at an early stage when you might not know how to filter all of that noise. So I think you really want to speak to people that have actually done it in as close as possible in your space, and try to get advice from those people. And so select a few voices that you trust and work closely with that core group of advisors, and make sure they've truly done it. And so I think that's absolutely critical. And then to the advice that I got in terms of getting out of the building, I think there's no better feedback than getting it from people who are ultimately going to be the decision makers in buying your product or evaluating the science behind, for example, the potential therapeutics. So talking to potential partners, talking to academic KOLs, and then also talking to your potential founding team. I mean, if you could convince people to
Tamer,
somebody else that you could bounce this by, and you want. Oh, did I drop off?
I think we lost about 5-10 seconds of what you were saying. If you want to just rewind a little bit.
Yeah. So the last point I was going to mention is really the team and the founding team specifically. I think the founding team is a great source of ideas, and I think showing that you could attract a team shows also validation that you could convince somebody else that this is an idea kind of worth tackling. So I mean, to bring that all together, I would say you're probably going to talk to your tech transfer office. After that, you probably are going to interact maybe with some incubation type platform, whether that's CDL or yet UBC. Stick to a set of trusted advisors that have actually done it, and focus on building a team that you trust and that's going to challenge you and that complement your skills. I think all of those kind of sources of people, I would hope would really kind of help you refine your idea, and help you take it to the next level.
Great, thanks very much, Tamer. I think you touched on a few really great points. Shana, I'm wondering if you might be able to sort of add or build upon what Tamer has articulated around, finding advisors and sort of knowing where to go, and not only knowing where to go and who to talk to, whether that's an advisor or an entrepreneurship accelerator, but how do you know what to do with the feedback that you get? So you're talking to these advisors, you're getting all these different perspectives. Some are maybe really positive, some not so positive. How have you sort of navigated that when you've been starting your companies to know what do I do with that advice that I get?
Yeah, great question. I mean, Tamer made a variety of really good points, including that, when you go to your tech transfer office, you should just be thinking about talking to one of the many, many partners that you're going to need to get something off the ground. And so, you go and talk to them, you try to get them on side, you want them to be a partner in whatever you're able to do, but you can't necessarily expect them to be the ones to do any launching or any, figuring out of what the next steps are. That is really going to be on you. And then it's also on you to figure out who to talk to take the advice, to figure out what to do with it. And I think I completely agree with the idea of, get out of the building, talk to as many people as will talk to you. Anybody that'll take a meeting, you should talk to them. And you will get a huge diversity of feedback. You will likely have people tell you that it's an idea we're not worth pursuing. You will have some people that are incredibly enthusiastic. And I think, in my own experience, you have the conversations, you take in the feedback, and then eventually there are things that just kind of resonate with the way that you are thinking about taking things forward. And it maybe gives you some more ammunition and helps you to build out the vision of what you're trying to move forward. And so that's how I've always dealt with it. If somebody's very critical, for sure, think about what they're telling you and why things might fail. But then also try to take, the more inspirational ideas, but maybe with the one flip side of that, I have certainly had the experience of going to talk to clinicians to try to get their perspective on what we're trying to do. And very often they get really excited about something that it turns out is an unmet clinical need, but it's kind of a corner case. If you really drill into it, they actually only see 2 patients a year that maybe have this corner case type of, disease or whatever. And so you have to be analytical enough to pick up on that, and to be analytical and critical of even the enthusiastic feedback that you get. But you will find people that their viewpoint really resonates with what you're thinking about. And in the end, again, it is all on you. I remember David Wall, who's one of the founders of Illumina. I'm very fortunate. He's been a mentor to me. He's a good friend. And he once told me, Shana, if you have a technology that you think should be, a company, it should be spun out, you've got to do it. You're really the only person who's going to care enough to go through everything you're going to have to go through to get this out there. So I think that's an important thing to kind of come to grips with, that you're not going to bump into somebody who's magically going to take it the rest of the way. It's likely going to be you.
Thanks, Shana. Certainly the initiative and the passion from both you and Tamer comes through as you talk about your experiences, and that's certainly something that I've seen over and over again, is that quality and that sort of perseverance that folks talked about at the beginning. The other important theme that I picked up on is this idea of, getting out of the building, talking to mentors, yes, but also talking to your potential customers, whether it's a clinician that's going to be using a device or a product at the end of the day, or others. And I'm actually thinking, Mara, you know, going to the CDL model, CDL was really built on this community of judgment and mentorship and providing and understanding what's the problem you're trying to solve and who are the customers that are interested in using it and what else is out there. Why do you have a better idea? And I'm wondering if you can maybe comment a bit on what you've seen from the early ventures that have gone through the health stream at Creative Destruction Lab.
Sure. Sort of lots there. And I just had one comment picking up on what Shana said about, you know, you're going to walk into a bunch of people and some of them are going to be super enthusiastic and some of them are going to be super negative. And how do you make sense of sort of the signals you're getting? And this is something, you know, companies that come to CDL will encounter in the mentor community. Some will be enthusiastic and some will be negative. And just a couple points on that before I go to your question. You know, one is the economist in me. As economists, we always think about incentives. And so you always want to think about the incentives people have to either be negative or enthusiastic about your idea. And I think this picks up on what Shane said. You may find that clinician who is so excited about it because you solve some narrow problem that they happen to be very focused on. But if you constantly seek out people like that to affirm your idea, you know, you're kind of missing sort of the broader data or feedback on it. On the flip side, on the negative, you know, there's sort of like an equally important question, but like, what do you do with negative feedback? And at what point do you let it shut you down versus ignore it? If you just push forward over the negative feedback, you could be spending time and resources on something that in fact isn't a bad idea, but if you just let the negative feedback shut you down, you're never going to do that hard work that, you know, Shane and Tamer have talked about. And so one of the things that, you know, I personally do when I run the CDL discussion is when there is sort of either negativity or, you know, I just don't think there's a business here or I just don't see it. I always try to flip it. I go back to the mentor who's saying that and I say, you know, maybe you're right. And I say, what could this entrepreneur do over the next 2 months? Because we work on a 2-month cycle. What could they do to persuade you that you're wrong? And so I don't just let them kind of shut it down. I say, you know, kind of what's the evidence that you're right, there's no idea, and what would be the evidence that they could change your mind? And they'll say, well, I don't think they can do it. But if they come back in 2 months with LOIs from 5 enterprise customers, let's say in a software setting, not a healthcare, then I'd be proven wrong. And so I think in those early conversations, when you're sort of floating your idea out there, if you get that kind of, I don't think there's something there, trying to turn it around to, well, what could I do? What could I show you? What could I accomplish to change your mind is a way to try to work through that negative feedback and actually turn into something constructive that actually causes you to unblock things that in fact might be important, sort of, you know, important hurdles you need to overcome. And that's just a way we even in business schools, even in sort of solving business problems, we use that approach of instead of saying why something won't work, tell me all the things that would need to be true for it to work. And then I can start working down that list of proving to you those things are true. And in fact, order those things on the ones least likely to be true, because let me put my effort on those first. So that I just see a lot of applicability in using that kind of framework in general, in casual conversations and more formally. In terms of, Alison, your question was about kind of think about customers and value propositions. I mean, we see a lot of this because we focus on deep science and deep technology startups. So we run programs in health. We have a couple hundred health companies across the CDL network. We take 50 in Toronto, 50 at UBC, another cohort at our site at Oxford in the UK. So health is a big focus. And then we have a bunch of health and life sciences startups, even intermingled in our AI programs and our general applied science programs across the network. But we also work in in frontier technologies like quantum computing and blockchain and technologies for commercializing space. And you know, where you don't have the exact same features, but the same thing in that you have research that's coming out of university labs in many cases. And so I think the biggest leap that founders need to make is the link between I have a great technology that I love, right, to at a fundamental level, what does the technology let us do that we couldn't do before, right? That's where there's going to be a breakthrough if we can now do something we couldn't do, or we can do something kind of much better, much faster, much cheaper, or on a different, scale. To what are the problems? And in this setting, it's largely, I guess, developing either new diagnostics or new therapeutics. What are the problems, or what are the disease areas, or the gaps in diagnostic capabilities or treatment capabilities that we can now solve because we can do something that we couldn't do before? And who owns that problem such that they'll pay for my solution? So I teach it. I just did this week, and we're running a boot camp for our quantum computing founders. And I just took them through those 4 steps. What's my technology? What does it make better or faster or cheaper? What problems does it solve? And who owns that problem and may pay for such a solution? And then I guess along with that is, what other solutions to that problem exist, and how do we compare to those solutions?
Great, thanks, Mara. That's certainly something within the Medicine by Design community, both our trainees and our investigators, is really helping folks understand that unmet need, and then also what else is out there, and marrying the two to really understand where the opportunity is, because often there are many opportunities. So it's understanding where the real value proposition lies. And Mike, I'm wondering from your perspective, I mean, you've worked, as you said, for large companies, the Baxters of the world, and then you've also, been in this startup environment for many, many years. And so anything that you can offer around, how do we start, even when our research is still in the lab, starting to understand the customers and what's out there? Any tips from your perspective that you've found particularly helpful over the years?
Sure. So I appreciate you pointing out that it's been many, many years in the startup industry.
Well, I didn't yet.
I think it's important to differentiate between a good idea and a good product. There are a lot of really cool ideas people come up with, but that does not mean that there is a place in the market for them. So that's really where a challenge comes, because you can talk to colleagues who are technical experts, subject matter experts, and they say, yeah, that's really great. That sounds technically sound. That would be an improvement on the state of the art. But there has to be a product. It has to be practicable, and you have to be able to sell it at a reasonable cost. So part of it is identifying, is there a clear unmet need? And this can be clinical or otherwise, but there has to be some kind of a driver for your product. Can you clearly state what that need is? Who will the customers be? Those are some things that you need to answer quite early on. Do some market research. Speak to folks who would potentially be users. You want trusted advisors. There's also value in getting the other side of the argument. The people who are going to use it, people who are naysayers. Listen to the negative feedback, but don't dwell on it, but be prepared to answer the contrarians with data, with a well thought out response, so that you're not just sort of kind of brushing away the negative criticism, but you're dealing with it. Maybe it means you have to approach the product or its implementation a new way. Maybe you need to redesign, reconsider. Will the product be useful? What kind of evidence or data would convince users that your product is good for its intended use, is superior to competing products out there? And when you're trying to talk to some of these potential customers, and of course you're not going to give away any confidential information. This is a bit of a trick, but at the same time, would they use it and would they pay for it? Because people will say, well, that's really cool. I'd love to have that. Well, yeah, that's fine, but what is the value proposition there?
Great, thanks, Mike. We have a question that's come in from the floor related to this great discussion around developing a product. So I'll read the question out, and then I'm happy for our panelists to jump in. Is when you're talking to whether it's a collaborator, a potential collaborator, or an advisor, how do you protect your idea? You know, and Mike, you actually just touched on this sort of drawing the line between talking about things in a non-confidential fashion versus disclosing more than you should. Any advice for any of our trainees in particular that are maybe going into these waters a bit uncharted? I wonder, Tamer, if you've got any experiences you can draw on from early in aspect stage. You sort of talk about things in a more, when do you know when to talk about things confidentially or in more detail?
Yeah, I think like storytelling is a skill you need to develop very, very, very quickly as an entrepreneur. At those early days, you're somewhat of an artist or a sculptor trying to kind of paint a vision with maybe some data to support kind of your claims. And as time goes by, you become more of a scientist because you have all of this data to prove all of your claims. And so you really need to be able to abstract things to a level that you could have a discussion that convinces somebody to back you, or a discussion that allows you to get feedback. And so I think that's absolutely critical. I think there's always a way you could abstract it to get that feedback. And if there isn't, then I think there may be something kind of wrong there. I think it could be a big turnoff if you go to investors or partners at a super early stage and you give them the impression that you can't even talk to them without an NDA in place. I think bringing that up is just really the wrong signal you want to send. There's obviously a time and place for that, and it'll come up organically, and that's a good sign that there's commitment there, especially on the partner side. Some investors will never sign NDAs, but with partners, that's usually a really good sign that now they've convinced, they're interested, you have their ears and their interest, and now they're ready to kind of dig into the details. So I guess to that point, I wouldn't let that fear sort of drive you kind of crazy, and it really sends off bad signals, and people think you're just kind of a paranoid person, and so it's just not good. So just really try to storytell, and so I think spend a lot of time kind of getting out there and trying to sell your vision, because they're really buying in you and in the vision, and you need to find a way to abstract it to either sell the vision, get somebody bought in the vision, or to get feedback. But don't bring up an NDA in the first conversation, second conversation.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, for some additional guidance, you want to talk about the why. Why is this required? Why is it a good idea? You want to talk a little bit about the what without giving away too much detail, but the how you keep close to the chest. You're not going to disclose the hows, and you may well not disclose the hows even if you had non-disclosures in place, because there will be some things that you'd rather keep as industrial secrets. And just taking forward from what Tamer said, you almost always will have to non-confidentially disclose some elements of your ideas. And so you need to come up with a convincing, 2 to 3 minute high level description of what you're trying to produce. And it's a vision that you're creating. You're creating excitement into a joint vision here. And if you can engage people into that vision, they will take on ownership. They'll get excited about it. So you don't want to be too blue sky, waving your arms in the air. You need to give them just enough information that you come across as legitimate, that you've got a real technology or idea that has legs, without disclosing too much. And this is tricky, but it is important, and you have to practice it. But I would suggest you get a 2 to 3 minute elevator pitch that effectively communicates why there's a demand, why it's a good idea, at a high level what you're doing, but don't explain the details of the how.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with that. And I mean, maybe just to point to a tangible kind of example that I'm sure many of you here are aware of like an academic publication, like show the abstract, the conclusion, the results, forget the methods. We often see papers where we try to recreate the results by looking at the methods, and it's hard, impossible. And so sometimes even academics do that as well. And so I think take out of a page out of that book, and yeah, don't go through the methods section.
That's a great way to frame it, Tamer. And I think we've honed in on the importance of communication, right? How do you communicate your idea in a convincing way, and then also ride this line of creating a vision and telling a story without disclosing too much. I think of the CDL sessions that I've sat in many times and hearing, you know, it's actually not the founders that introduce the companies at Creative Destruction Lab, it's the mentors that introduce on behalf of the founder. So I'm wondering, Mara, if you could comment on some of the tips that CDL uses to guide their ventures in crafting their elevator pitch. And then we'll go to Shana to hear some stories from her in crafting elevator pitches for her various companies.
Sure. So just I'll give 1 minute of background of how it works, because Allison's been in our room and some of the others have, but probably not all of you. So the way a typical CDL session day, which used to run every 8 weeks on campus, now we run them virtually. The way it would be structured is the companies who are admitted would spend the morning having a series of small group meetings, either with 1 or 2 mentors. They'd be 20 minutes in length. They'd maybe have 5 of these, and they would lead. They would lead those meetings in advance of the meetings. The mentors would be given briefing documents that the CDL staff prepare. So that's the first place where we kind of see this delta between the information communicated by the founders and then the information that's passed on to the mentors. Our staff do quite a bit of work, actually, taking what's given to them from the founders, asking questions, and then formatting it and sort of recommunicating it in a way that allows for really efficient preparation by our mentors. So we share these documents, we call our venture documents, and just to give you a sense of what's in them, they'll have, you know, they ask, you know, describe your core technology in non-technical terms. What is the single biggest dimension of technical advantage? These are all things that get sort of 2-sentence answers, not 2-page answers. Describe how your product would be used by a typical customer. What is the value proposition? Who else is competing to meet the same needs? And in what ways are you similar or superior to them? So those are the types of things. And it's actually quite interesting to look at the work we do from what we get to how we send it out. You know, the value proposition is often still describing what the technology does, as opposed to what the technology delivers to the user and payer. And that's one place where we have to do a lot of work. Describe your core technology in non-technical terms, you can imagine, is very hard for a lot of technical founders because they live and breathe it in those technical terms. So that's one place where we work with them on communication. Of course, we do that work and then we send these documents back to them. And we let them ask questions and you know, we iterate a little bit, but part of why we do that is because we want to help them sort of learn how do you speak and communicate with the business mentors in the most effective way. And I guess the one other part that's interesting is the top of every document has what we call our venture description. No more than 2 sentences. And when I'm training my team, I say, this is the absolute most important part you can do, because if our mentors read the venture description and don't understand what the venture does, you know what they do? They stop reading the rest of the document. They're not going to do the work if they're confused right at the beginning. And so that's sort of part one of it. Part two is so that these documents get sent, the companies have these meetings in the morning. Everything about the CDL session day is focused around 3 objectives. So that's the way we transfer what we call business judgment from our mentors to our technical founders. Instead of them just having 6 meetings where they might meet 12 mentors and everybody says, I think you should do this. I think you should do this. Have you thought about that market? Talk to this customer. So they walk out more confused. What we don't want is them to walk out more confused and less focused than they come in. So at CDL, every company leaves with 3 objectives that are set for them by the mentors and sort of agreed upon by the broader group of mentors. And those objectives are the 3 most important priorities for them to spend their time and money on over the next 8 weeks. And they may be product development. They may be, you know, various steps in the regulatory approval process. They may be hiring. They may be fundraising. They may be customer discovery. They may be building out a go-to, you know, they could be anywhere, and different companies will have different types of objectives each time. So in the morning, they have these one-on-one meetings where they talk about these priorities. In the afternoon, every company comes into sort of a boardroom or classroom setting where there's a facilitated discussion among the mentor and scientist community around that company. And it starts with an introduction. And so what Allison is referring to is we make an explicit decision at CDL. We don't let the founders introduce their companies. And at first that seems crazy because, you know, why not give the founders a time to speak, and who could know their their business better. But what we've learned is if we assign that job to one of our mentors who's received the documents, who's met the company in the morning, and who knows that's their job, they're able to do a much better job and we only give them 90 seconds, not even 2 to 3 minutes. Sometimes they take 2 to 3 to introduce the company. And essentially, if you watch the ones who do it well, they start by saying what kind of company it is, right? So this is a biotech company. This is a hardware company. This is a medical device company. They talk about, so what kind of company is it? Their core technology is, a unique platform for, whatever it may be. And something about the value proposition, they're going to deliver. And often they'll refer, because they're introducing them to a group who maybe didn't meet them, to some of the specific technical expertise of the founders that are, that make them particularly well suited for what they're going to do. And so, that's kind of how we coach our founders. Don't start with your technology. What type of company are you trying to build? What problem are you solving? How does your technology do that? And why are you the right team to do that?
Great, thanks, Mara. Shana, I know that you've been involved in CDL, but you also started companies long before CDL existed. And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of your experience in crafting an elevator pitch, whether formal or informal, and maybe some early experiences in communicating with investors at early stages of company development.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a lot of good comments have been made already. I mean, this idea of an elevator pitch, I think it's useful. Let's say if you're at the JP Morgan healthcare company, you're actually going to get an elevator and you might bump into somebody and they ask you, who are you and what do you do? And you tell them and maybe you pique their interest. And there's a couple other situations where very generic elevator pitches are useful. But the rest of the time, you really need to have 20 different elevator pitches at your fingertips. And you have to be able to quickly assess, who am I talking to? And most of the time, if you're trying to get a company off the ground, you're trying to get a partnership, you're talking to an expert audience. And so your elevator pitch should probably get right at what you're doing and why it's different from the 25 other groups that have just come in before you. Because I think, in our space, in the life sciences space, healthcare, biotech, it's crowded. There's a lot of people doing the same thing, slightly differently, but we're all, we're solving similar problems. And so if you can quickly get at why what you're doing is different, why it's game changing, why you're gonna be able to do something that your competition can't, and why you have a vision about how to take it where it is to something truly, again, paradigm shifting, financially lucrative, all of these things, then you'll get people's attention because again, especially when it comes to investors, they talk to so many people and it can be really difficult to get and hold somebody's attention. And I completely agree with Tamer. I mean, you have to learn how to do that quickly. It's kind of a sink or swim exercise. And I've sunk a few times and almost drowned. I mean, I remember pitching a very, a top tier Boston VC, and I came to the meeting and I was really excited to have gotten a meeting with these guys. And I thought it was going to be a great meeting because there were amazing people in the room and probably the most senior partner of anybody in the room. I had brought printouts of my deck because I'm like a backup person and I always want to have printouts in case there's some. And he took my printout and he flipped through it, just page in about 30 seconds, turned it over, and then pulled out his phone and just sat on his phone for the rest of the meeting. So clearly I had sunk, and I didn't get his attention with what I was saying. And it was kind of early days on something that we were trying to do. And I realized we just sounded too much like the 10 companies that had come in before. And it doesn't even matter if your technology can really hit the application and everybody who came in before you can't really do what they say they're doing. It doesn't matter. You still have to be able to differentiate yourself, and through your track record, through your vision, through a unique angle, through the partners that you've already brought into your effort, you've got to grab people's attention and then keep it. And learning how to do that, it's hard. It's not for everybody. I mean, if you don't It doesn't come that naturally to you. You're going to have to work pretty hard at it. But, you know, it is about crafting a story and sticking with it and figuring out how to make it really, really exciting to other people.
Great, thanks, Shana. Yeah, I think the investors can certainly be tough audiences, and I think in many cases, you know, timing also comes into place, and what else is happening in the space at a particular time. Another question from the panel, and I'm actually going to direct this one towards Mike. So we've just spent the last few minutes talking about value propositions and, you know, speaking with investors and how do we craft this this elevator pitch. And I'm wondering, Mike, you know, if we think about partnering with industry. And maybe it's, you know, you're still in the lab and your team is being, you know, is approaching industry on a project that Medicine by Design is funding or that Prime is funding. How do you reach out to a company like BlueRock, engage interest and sort of navigate those early discussions around potential industry partners? Because that's another way, you know, we can start companies, but we can also, you know, advance our research through collaboration with industry. So thoughts and experiences on that front.
Yeah, I think it's challenging from both sides, both for companies to find novel technologies and also for somebody with a great idea and technology to find the right partner. I would caution, I mean, the tech transfer office can be helpful, but back to some comments that were made right at the beginning of this discussion, nobody has more skin in the game than you do as the owner of the technology, as the developer. So don't rely on the tech transfer office to put together a mass email and send it out to their 500 deep email list of industry contacts, hoping that somebody's going to bite at it. You need to be more targeted and thoughtful. And reach in wherever possible. This is where networking can become really helpful. I wish that there was some easy, clear way to communicate with all the right people, but because of the specific nature of a lot of technologies, it's challenging to be able to get in front of the right people at a company. So use your contacts, use networking opportunities. There are in professional industry groups, conferences. These can all be sources of making the right connections. I mean, once you have connections, it's easy. Don't confuse LinkedIn connections with real connections either. Those can be helpful, but you know, that's a social network for business. It can be useful for finding people. So for example, identify a few companies that make products that are in the same sphere as what you're developing. And then look at who are the people at that company, and you can try reaching out to them. Now, that's tough, right? That's cold calling. So it's always good if you've got an in. And so it's, in a way, it's who you know. I kind of jumped around a little bit there, but you know, I think there's a fair bit of art in trying to make the right connections with the right people at industry.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, the value of networking is, you know, I still remember as a grad student sort of finishing my PhD, and, you know, the whole networking thing seemed quite daunting. And I always say to people when they ask about networking or how do you get used to it or how do you network well, is just do it. And every time you go to a, you know, whether it's an in-person session or a, you know, a dinner, or now, you know, virtual sessions, is that it's like giving a scientific talk. The more you do it, the easier it gets. So certainly just, you know, getting out there as much as you can. So I have a question actually for this is for everyone, and it's maybe going sort of back to Mara's earlier point around negative feedback and how to manage that and knowing what to do with it. Another question from the floor is, you know, how do you manage rejections, whether it's from an investor, you know, Shana, your experience of an investor sort of tuning out and feeling like you've sort of sunk the pitch, or a prospective industry partner, how do you manage that without sort of burning the connection, you know, knowing that maybe, you know, a year from now or 6 months from now or another, you know, venue might present itself where you can re-engage. And so I'm happy to have anyone jump in and maybe share an experience where something hasn't gone well, but you've been able to turn that around and re-engage at a later point in time.
Maybe I'll just start. I mean, I think you always just have to take the feedback constructively. You know, we're all trying to work towards the same goals. We're trying to start, fund, partner with successful companies, and you may get negative feedback, and the best thing you can do is take the feedback, thank the people that gave it to you, for taking the time to actually give you some feedback, and then just move on. It's a very, very small world. And so that group that you've had that negative interaction with, it'll come full circle and you'll see them again. And maybe on the next pass, it won't be negative because you conducted yourself in a way that makes clear, you're all about business. You're all about getting the feedback, taking into consideration, making the next idea better. And groups like to, at a personal level, they like to work with individuals like that. So if you take the feedback in a constructive way, it's much more likely that the partnership, maybe if it comes back around, that there's a second shot there.
And I would say, don't take it personally. When they're reacting to the pitch you put in front of them. And yes, you are fully invested and it's consuming your life, but they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting perhaps the concept, the pitch, the way you've presented it. So I like what Mara said, they insist on some of their mentors. If a mentor says, I don't like this idea, I think it's a bad idea, they say, well, why? So try to get that back. When you get that negative feedback, okay, accept it, just accept it. You're not going to change their mind. If they're not going to buy the car, they're not going to buy the car. But why don't they like this car? Is there something you can change about it? Is it the color? Is it the comfort of the seats? Is it the performance? Try to get something from them so you can turn that negative feedback into something positive. So the next time you pitch, you're taking into account that negative feedback.
Really like that, Mike, turning it around and, again, learning as much as you can from the perspectives that have been shared with you. Tamer, I'm sure in your journey with Aspect Biosystems, you've had a whole range of experiences engaging with investors. You've been successful in raising a substantial amount of money. Any stories that you can share from your experience?
Yeah, maybe I could start off with a few kind of lessons that I've learned, and I'm sure I'll remember a few stories. If I think of a few kind of key lessons are, the first one being like, you really need to ask for advice, like in the early days. Frankly, even now, like my approach is like feedback is way more valuable than capital, because the secret that nobody tells you is that there's way more capital out there than great ideas. And so if you could actually focus on kind of getting advice and getting feedback and truly validating that you're onto something, you're going to get the capital. So I think trying to really kind of focus on kind of advice and really setting a stage in those early conversations and telling that particular person that, listen, I recognize that early, I'm here to get feedback on these several points. And what I've often found really happen several times is you ask people for advice and they end up giving you money, or they end up becoming a partner, because you take them through that journey. They get educated. They feel that their input is being taken into consideration, if it really should be. And then often you end up meeting at a point where there's alignment. And so I think that's really important. Don't try to sell something to somebody when you're really trying to get feedback in those early days. And so if you look at your pitch, for example, like start off with a 30, 40 page kind of slide deck that you could use to kind of get your thoughts organized, sit with a trusted advisor, break it down, tell them how you're thinking, and then slowly narrow that down to kind of a beautiful kind of 10 slide deck. And then at that point, maybe you're ready to sort of sell. So yeah, that would be my first kind of point of advice there is really set the stage, set expectations, look for advice versus money. And I've often had investors, like, to be honest, probably most of my biggest investors now are people that I've went to ask advice for and are now sort of big parts of the company. So that would be my most important, I would say, lesson learned. The other lesson I would say is, I think one of the greatest traits of entrepreneurs are they're so naive. They think they can take on anything. They find a solution in every problem. Don't let investors, who in many ways are designed to think of problems and solutions, don't let them kind of turn your mindset, because then you know that they've kind of defeated you. So I think you really have to sort of develop that filter, take all the feedback, be respectful, but gravitate towards the people that are giving you constructive feedback, gravitate towards the people that are giving you more clarity, and surround yourself with experience. Experience is great, but experience could be super, super, super dangerous, because like I would argue the most experienced person ever will probably find a reason everything is not going to work. You need those people around you, like in certain functions and certain roles, to challenge you, to refine you. But at the end of the day, like if you look at the people that went to the moon, the average age these people that were sent to the moon, they said we chose them because they never knew anything better. They just went to the moon because they thought that they could.
Thanks for that, Tamer. Yeah, certainly. I think that the combination of naivety, perseverance, being curious, and asking questions, and certainly that journey of building relationships with people and starting at an early point of storytelling and not disclosing too much, and sort of getting comfortable with talking about your ideas and your visions. As if are themes that have been coming out over the last hour or so. We've taken a few questions from the floor, and it's so interesting because the questions that we're getting are ones that I was really hoping we would get, and it's great to see that people are really curious about the process and in the perspectives of the panel. I thought maybe we would take a few minutes to shift towards talking a little bit about risk. Mara, you touched upon it. Tamer, you've touched upon just the amount of risk that an entrepreneur has to be willing to take, particularly in the biotech life sciences sector. When we're thinking about longer development timelines, it can be daunting. I know, just as a former entrepreneur myself, you can sort of look at that path, and it seems like there are so many steps and so much money to raise and so much risk to mitigate. How do we break down risk? How do we sort of dial it back and piece it out so that it doesn't seem so overwhelming? Mara, you talked a little bit about CDL's objective setting process. 3 things we're going to do over the next quarter. I'd be interested in hearing from Tamer and maybe from Mike as well. When BlueRock was getting off the ground, is how do you parse out risk and think of things in terms of manageable, bite-sized pieces as you start to take technology out of the research academic lab and into a commercial setting?
Maybe I could kind of share my thoughts. I mean, I completely agree with Mara's framework in terms of breaking down a complex problem into a set of questions that you could go out and validate. Like, break it down into like an actionable set of hypotheses that could either be proved or disproved. I think that's so critical, and that's what I mean when I say the importance of first principles thinking for an entrepreneur. I think scientists and engineers are in a good position to approach that, because that's kind of what we're taught, a good scientific approach. Start off with your hypothesis, go out and test it. And so I think following that scientific method is absolutely sort of critical. Any complex problem could be broken down into those sort of actionable items. And I would, again, to Mara's point, so really I'm just echoing Mara, so I'm sorry, this is just a repetition, but I just completely agree with it. I think prioritizing the things that could frankly make the idea useless at first. You don't want to waste time, and so prioritize those things first and foremost. And so I think there's a temptation sometimes to maybe do the experiments or to get the feedback that makes us feel good and just keep something alive. Let's just keep it alive. Let's do that. Let's just show that this thing could walk instead of running, and let's just do those easy things. That becomes super dangerous, because you give yourself sort of a false sense of validation. So yeah, I think hearing that even from Mara emphasizes something that I truly believe in, and so I still try to echo that philosophy, that aspect at any moment I can.
So I break it into a few different sections. There are the technical issues, and these are the ones that we're typically good at as scientists and engineers. But the questions, especially in the biological sciences, do you understand the mechanism of action? Can you explain it? Do you have data that proves that you understand the mechanism of action? Is it practical? Does it bring enough value? And to echo Tamer's point, try to make the product fail, not to try to make the idea or the company fail, but to improve robustness of the product process, because you want to know early. If it's not going to work, let's know now. Let's not spend $1 million in a year and then figure out that it's not going to work. The second one is business risk. Do you have enough business knowledge to drive the business aspect of it? In many cases, the founders are not the best people to drive the business. And companies, startups that are successful, oftentimes the founders step aside and they hire in a CEO. They hire in somebody who's a business leader, and they remain a technical founder or CTO type role. So then you start to get into questions about, can you make the product affordably? What could you charge for it? What would your actual cost of goods sold be? You gotta, it's fairly early on, you gotta figure out what are the economics. And if there's not a positive economic like return on investment, then you're not gonna get anybody to invest in it. And they're gonna ask you questions you don't have answers to. So you're gonna have to make your best guess and try to be convincing. Once you get past those early stages of technical and business risk, now you've got other sources of risk that can tank your product, which would be patient and user safety risk, regulatory risk, and clinical risk. So, you know, there's no shortage of risk in this world, as we all know, because we're eliminating one source of risk by having a virtual discussion here. But, you know, stage it and focus on the risks that are right in front of you, the big ones that can tank your efforts.
Great. Shana, I'm wondering, you know, you run a big lab at U of T and you've worked with, many industry partners. Prime is very translationally focused. When we think about risk or mitigating risk, even in lab, when we think about, the experimental plan or the research plan of a project, in understanding mechanism of action, or conducting pivotal experiments to drive the research forward. Any advice for the trainees or PIs on the line as they start to think about their research plan under a project, and how you might design experiments to mitigate risk before you even get out of the lab with the idea for the product?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in fail fast. Try something new, go off in a really exciting direction where maybe nothing's ever been done, but then figure out if you're going to fail as fast as you can. Because, even if you're taking on, let's say, a PhD that could be 5 years, it seems like a lot of time. But if you're floundering around for 2 years, you're going to be in trouble. And that timeline is not going to be one that you're going to be very happy with. And I think, there are certainly examples of people that just, toiled away at something for years and years and years, and then broke through because all the negative data had informed them in a way that they were the only people in the world that could have discovered what they discovered. But most science is not like that. At least in my experience, you do some exploratory stuff, and it's usually, you're exploring down a path, but something very interesting happens over here and you happen to notice. Right. And then you go look at what's happening over there, and then you find something really interesting. So I'm a huge believer in taking risks. I think risk is a very personal thing. Some people have a tolerance for risk. Other people do not. It's just part of who you are. And if you do have a tolerance for risk, then you're a startup person, you're an exploratory research type person, you're somebody that can take some crazy idea and try to flush it out. It's not going to drive you crazy. It's not going to make you uncomfortable. But I have seen, if you take somebody that is risk averse and you try to plug them into something exploratory, or your early days of a startup and you're just trying to get a technology to the next level, it creates huge problems. You're just asking somebody to do something that their personality is not well matched with. So I think it's just an important thing to understand your own, tolerance and where you feel comfortable along the spectrum of like very early phase exploratory stuff to, being the person who gets a product from, beta prototype to clinical prototype, the kind of less risky part of things. There's a place for everybody, but that risk tolerance is a big part of the fit.
Allison, can I just jump in on picking up on a couple of these
Yes.
points? So, I mean, I couldn't, just in what I observe being in this entrepreneurship community now, I couldn't agree with Shana more. I mean, this isn't for everyone. And I think the hard thing, and this actually, I'll make my point and then maybe you put this back out to our founders, is when you're an early stage founder, you need to do so much yourself that you need to be the person who tolerates risk and the person who leads the science and the person who does the storytelling. And that's so hard because, you know, many of us are good at sort of a small number of things. Few people are good at all of those things. When you have enough resources and things are concrete enough, you can hire people who are good at those different things. But as a super small and early founding team, how do you get good at all of them? And so that's just a question. I don't have an answer to that, but I'd be curious to hear from these guys, you know, because I think that would be so relevant to the people listening. The other just last point I'll say is this idea of the pivotal experiments that Shana was talking about, picking up on what Tamer said, you know, that's true in the business part too. There's the pivotal business experiments, just as there's the pivotal lab experiments that tell you whether the technology works. There's those pivotal, you know, early proof of concepts where you put a product, for example, in a customer's business and you learn whether or not it delivers the intended results. You learn what are all of the complementary organizational changes or investments or behavior change that need to happen. You learn, I would imagine, if you try to put something, this happens in our health rooms a lot, you know, people have ideas, these products, but they haven't thought about how they may integrate into clinical workflows and hospital IT systems. And the people who have done that before think, you know, your product's going to fail, not because your product's going to fail, but it's just not going to integrate with how physicians get information or whatever it may be. So that idea of a pivotal experiment, as Tamer said, as scientists, your inclination to use the scientific method is so useful for testing those business hypotheses as well as those scientific hypotheses. So I just wanted to add that, but I thought maybe putting back to these guys this question of like, how do you wear so many hats as an early, scientific technical founder of a company? Maybe they have some advice.
Yeah, great question, Tamer. Any tips for our audience on how to wear multiple hats as you get a venture off the ground?
Yeah, I think having kind of a great founding team is absolutely important. So I've been super fortunate to have 3 other amazing co-founders. We've been through a ton of challenges and a ton of kind of high points together. So I couldn't imagine doing this again, even with just one other co-founder, but definitely at least find another co-founder and make sure that kind of founder mission control center isn't an echo chamber. So you want people that have different skills. You want sort of the person who kind of challenges. You want the person who kind of is creative and curious. You want the person who is more analytical. You want the visionary. So you need sort of a mix of talents. And I would say I agree kind of with the points that Michael was saying in terms of there are some kind of founders out there that aren't meant to be the long-term CEOs, and that timing kind of varies. But I also believe that if the founder is the right CEO, they could be the best CEOs, because it's just so hard to recreate that passion and that vision to inspire people to come and keep them motivated. So I wouldn't start off maybe with that mindset that like I only need to take it to a certain point. I would start off with the mindset is I'm open to building this company in the way it should be built, which means getting the right people in every right position. But start off with a you are that person or not. But don't start off with a mentality that the CEO needs to be a business person. To be somebody with a little bit more experience. If you look at some of the most valuable companies, deep tech companies today in the world, kind of prayers. So, kind of to say is, I would say, could you still hear me?
Oh, we're losing you a little bit, Tamer. All right, it looks like Tamer's frozen for the moment. Okay, looks like you're back. Tamer, you cut out a little bit there. I think I caught the gist of what you were saying, but you maybe want to just
my experiment of taking this call worked out. Disproven. But yeah, I'll stop there because the internet is actually becoming super choppy. So I'll pass it on to the other panelists.
Perfect, thanks. Shana, anything to add around the sort of this challenge as an early venture or a founder, trying to wear the multiple hats and how you sort of manage that?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of realizing that, you know, you can cover the bases that are needed. I mean, it's, you know, you can have a management team of 10 people that all have their specialized role and they're all really good at what they're doing. But in the beginning, you don't have that luxury, you don't have the resources. And so you can pick up enough to go through. I mean, I was just thinking about experiences that I've had, and I remember with my last company, once we closed a Series A investment, the investors, okay, we're going to have a board meeting. Here's our expectations for the board meeting. And they expected me, I was kind of the only management level person that had been installed at the company at that point, to produce a set of financial statements. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I guess I better get to work. And, you know, I talked to a bunch of people. How can I do this? I don't know anything about accounting. I don't, you know, like I'm a scientist, I don't really know anything about this. And eventually somebody showed me a pretty simple way to do it. And I just kind of followed through and plugged the numbers in, and I produced a set of statements. And, you know, I would never try to like produce a set of audited financial statements, but I muddled through, you know, and I just did what people asked me to do by not panicking, asking some people for help, finding a simple solution, and then just giving it my best shot. And that's kind of an extreme example because, you know, financial accounting is pretty technical. But, you know, with pretty much everything, you know, you kind of muddle through the parts you have to until you can get the expertise in that's going to help you do it at the level that you need to be successful. So it's just, I think a lot of it is just about not being afraid to not do it perfectly. You know, you just kind of are going to say, all right, I'm going to do this part of things and maybe not perfectly, but it's the best you can do in the beginning.
Great, thanks, Shana. You know, we've talked a lot over the last, you know, hour and a half, and I'm cognizant that we only have a few minutes remaining. We've talked a lot about, you know, as a founder or as the lead on trying to commercialize something or to start a venture. But I'm wondering, you know, what about those who are less risk adverse, less, you know, comfortable with thinking about things in terms of being a founder? How can other people contribute to startups within the Toronto ecosystem? I'm going to flip to Mike because BlueRock has all sorts of, you know, folks in the organization that are very entrepreneurial, but maybe, you know, weren't part of that startup team at BlueRock. And I'm wondering if you can comment on how, you know, other folks can contribute to a successful venture.
Well, certainly as the company grows, you're going to require expertise in a lot of different areas. And the reality for all of us is that we got bills to pay. You have a mortgage, you want to put your kids through school, you have to put food on the table. And the willingness to take on risk in your professional life is really dependent on what are your obligations, responsibilities, but also your self-confidence. Are you confident that, well, if this thing does fail, you know, that's okay, I can get another job. I've been responsible financially, I have 3 months of salary and savings, you know, I'm going to bounce back. And that comes back to the willingness to take risk. So, you know, we have a variety of employees. Obviously, we've got about almost 80 now in Toronto, and they vary from quality assurance specialists to research associates to senior scientists to vice presidents. And not all of those people would start a company. In fact, many of those people probably wouldn't have the risk tolerance to start a company. But once there's a core group there that builds the story, builds the confidence, creates the vision, and starts to engage people in that vision, it becomes easier to get over the risk aversion. And this has been the same at all startup companies. It's you get these folks who just believe in what the company is doing, and they're willing to take that risk because they have the chance to cure diabetes. They have a chance to impact congestive heart failure and maybe save people's lives. Maybe they've got friends, relatives, and so in the life science area, it tends to be a little easier to bring people in because the human need can be so great.
Thanks, Mike. Just noting that we've only got a few minutes left, and I wanted to end on sort of a bigger picture note. I hope that all of our participants have gotten some good perspective and advice. I love the going back 15 years or less in the case of Tamer being in high school, and I think back 15 years ago to what Toronto looked like when I was an entrepreneur working at a startup, and Mars didn't, barely existed yet. Things were just getting off the ground, and
Looks like it was our turn to lose Allison.
Hi, everyone.
Just me?
Yes, we've lost Allison. I'm just going to jump in for the final question. I believe where Allison was going is, instead of looking 15 years backwards, how can we look to the future, particularly in the Toronto ecosystem? Where do the panelists see the Toronto ecosystem going, and sort of what are the strengths of the community? And maybe Michael, you can have some perspective on having BlueRock have a headquarters in Canada, but also in the US. Maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. So Toronto has a lot of great strengths in our ecosystem. There are also some areas where we dearly love to grow. And, we've got great educational institutions, a lot of terrific human resources. That's part of the reason that BlueRock has such a large footprint in Toronto. We've got some pretty reasonable support from government agencies too. The regulations are not overbearing. The problem we have is kind of a chicken and an egg. And for example, one of the challenges we've got in BlueRock is hiring senior level managers in areas like, cell biology and differentiation, which are very specialized, very cutting edge. But you need that kind of leadership and industry leadership. So that's what we need to help us grow more in Canada, I think. But we've got a ton of great ingredients, including some phenomenal ideas and invention. What we need to do is grow our innovation culture.
Shana, what about your perspective? Where do you think we're going next, and what opportunities should we be capitalizing to grow the innovation ecosystem here in Canada, in particular in the biotech sector?
Yeah, from my perspective, I do think we need more ways to get companies launched. Toronto is a research powerhouse in the life sciences. We are on par with Boston and San Francisco and all the other great centers across the world, but we don't have the same kind of ecosystem in the sector. We don't have the anchor companies, and that's a problem. We're seeing some successes with some companies that were venture backed that are IPOing and doing great things, and you can see that part of the ecosystem starting to thrive. But I think we need mechanisms to feed the ecosystem more and get significant numbers of seed financing done, so that there are these smaller companies that can grow into larger companies that can become anchor companies. And that's seed phase capital is, I think, the hardest thing to find right now in our ecosystem. There's ways to solve this through government. There's other ways to solve it. And I think that's one of our biggest unmet needs.
I couldn't agree more. That seed phase, pre-seed phase for really early ventures remains a big challenge. Mara, CDL plays an important role in that pre-seed early venture creation world. What about you? What's your perspective and how we capitalize on some of the successes that CDL has had, and how do we continue to support more early stage ventures at that stage?
I think one of the premises on which CDL was founded is that what early stage startups need the most is access, and this has come up in everybody's comments, is access to people who have done it before successfully. That came up right at the beginning of our panel in terms of talk to people who have done it, find a mentor. It came up, you know, in Mike's comments about, you know, bring in, at some point, many companies bring in experienced management who have done it before. And so you really have this problem, which is like, if that's what you need to get started, but if until you get started, you haven't created any of those people, because we don't have a lot of companies that have scaled and exited, then you're screwed in some sense, right? Like, what, you know, how do you do that? And that's really the premise of CDL when we started, is we need to, was literally, we were founded on this question of, why does Canada have such incredible science and not keeping up, you know, and commercialization that is not on par with that? Right. And it's exactly, you know, what was just said. We are on par with Boston and other hubs in terms of the science, but not the commercialization. And the answer we proposed is because the commercialization requires sort of intense access to a network of mentors who have commercialized before. And so when we started, we sort of found those people from across Canada. Now we find them from across the world. We have people flying in from Boston and Europe. And so we need to, I think, you know, how the ecosystem will grow will be as we support more of these companies and we have more of these successes. We, number one, need to try to keep them in Canada, and we need to keep their founders and their executive team super engaged with the Canadian ecosystem, particularly in this way of bringing back that experience and that judgment of here's how you do it. I mean, I think the other part that's interesting, I don't have an answer here, it's just something I'm thinking about, is, you know, even in a world before COVID that felt very virtual, you know, we always had this sense that like physically proximate communities matter, right? That's why universities have like core groups in biology or chemistry, because the biologists want to be with a bunch of other biologists. And we understand kind of agglomeration, you know, urban economists have thought about that. Now we're seeing that we can collaborate, you know, more than we thought, I think, across geographic boundaries. My hunch is local sort of, you know, these local ecosystems are still going to matter a lot. But I'm curious to see whether or not this sort of grand experiment of COVID makes us realize that we don't need as many VCs or seed stage investors in Canada. We just need the mechanisms to engage them. And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, the world is just evolving so quickly in this COVID era. It will be interesting to see. I mean, I certainly think about going, you know, back to work, back to Mars. You know, I miss that environment, that proximity, but it certainly, I think we're learning we can do a lot more virtually. We're just about at time, but Michael and Tamer, I want to give you an opportunity to give some final comments on any of the aspects that we've touched on this morning. Tamer, how about you go first?
I mean, I think Shana and Mara really summed it up well. I think we have no shortage of awesome scientific kind of innovation, technical innovation here. We're starting to see some success with these VC-backed companies going public. I think just having that continuous belief and trying to also create these amazing sort of systems like CDL and others. We certainly didn't have that at the time when we started. I think it would have been really beneficial. I think all of those types of things will only help, but let's kind of increase our belief that we can do it, and I'm sure we can. And I'll pass it on to Michael.
Looks like Michael might be frozen. We'll see if he comes back. But while we're waiting for him to defreeze, I wanted to thank all of our panelists for sharing your insights, for being candid with the stories and experiences that you've had. To the participants on the line, thank you for all of your great questions and for being curious. I hope that this session has inspired you to network, to seek out mentors, to follow up with myself, with the panelists, to learn more. I'm sure that those that have participated today would be happy to connect, to talk about their experiences more. And I'm looking forward to your feedback on this session and to all of the sessions that we ran for Translation Talks. We will be doing this again next year. We hope to be able to host Summer by Design in person, and we will be building in some of these new elements into our future translation discussions. And on behalf of the entire Medicine by Design team, thanks for participating today and for participating in all of the sessions. It's hard to believe we started this in mid-June and it's now almost August. So thanks everyone, and I'm going to do a last check-in with Mike to see if he's able to Nope, he looks like he's frozen. So with that, thanks everyone, and I look forward to speaking with you all in the very near future.
Thanks, Allison.
Bye everyone.